So we've got a chapter on equity. This is a new chapter, equity in specific populations, where consideration of health equity is obviously the focus, considering the absence of avoidable and unfair differences in health. So there's advice on the use of logic models and theories of change to start to develop hypotheses about equity, and there's advice also on study designs and outcomes. And this chapter, like all of the chapters in this section of the review, follows the same structure in terms of giving you an overview about the special issues to consider, and then step by step through the standard review process. So in a timely way, the chapter on intervention complexity, many of you might have spotted that there's a new series that's just been published, I think yesterday, on BMJ Global Health, which this chapter draws on quite heavily, and many of the authors on the chapter are also authors on some of those papers there. So there's a good moment to go and check them out. The URL's there if you want to go and have a look. One of the key points about this one really is that we want to consider really intervention complexity rather than complex intervention. By this, what we're trying to get at is that complexity isn't a property which is inherent in an intervention, but it's something which might be considered in many different types of intervention. And really what we need to be thinking about is what aspects of complexity help us to sort of get analytical purchase, to help to understand what's going on in the question that we've got in front of us. I won't go into the detail on this. I suggest you go and read the chapter if you're interested in reading more on this one. We've got the chapter on patient-reported outcomes, really critical area, thinking about what patient-reported outcomes are, why we need to use them at times, but then also considering issues about how to go about using patient-reported outcomes and patient-reported outcome measures through the review process, thinking about measurement in particularly, and reliability and validity, and sort of aspects of bias. So a chapter on PROs. Chapter on adverse effects. Our advice is that all reviews should try to consider adverse aspects of interventions, particularly important when the evidence for harms might affect particular decisions being taken on the basis of a review. We've got to bear in mind about some of the challenges of addressing adverse effects. One is that adverse effects are not monitored as well as potentially beneficial outcomes. We've got issues about inadequate monitoring and complete reporting to consider. And also we might need to look at a wider range of types of studies, for example, the inclusion of non-randomized studies, if we're properly to investigate adverse effects. Economic evidence, as I mentioned earlier, is another aspect which really helps decision makers. Often decisions need to be taken in the light of evidence about often relative costs of interventions, and obviously if we're thinking about optimal decisions, we really do need to be thinking about being able to lay our hands on cost effectiveness evidence. There are a couple of different methodological frameworks which the group has, the methodology group in this area has advanced, a brief economic commentary, and also an integrated full systematic review of economic evidence. And this chapter is very much focused on the brief economic commentaries, and the aim really is to help people to work and to add value in this area without necessarily requiring support from a health economist, but it's very much a minimal framework, they would say, and what we're also in discussion about with the group at the moment about where to include guidance on full integrated systematic reviews of economic evidence. Qualitative research has almost got the same chapter number rather as the previous volume, even though lots of chapters have moved around. And this chapter really focuses on how qualitative evidence synthesis can add value, thinking about intervention complexity, variations due to context, implementation, etc., and how to bring in stakeholder preferences, experience into the review. And this chapter has been considerably reworked in the light of a lot of other methodological papers that the team has published. And so it's very much a signposting chapter, a little bit like the complexity chapter in that sense. So I'll hand back to Julian now.
Great. So just very quickly, some of the extra chapters towards the end of the handbook. James has already mentioned some of the issues we've included in this expanded version of a chapter on prospective approaches. Whereas in version 5, we had a chapter about prospective meta-analyses or prospectively planned meta-analyses. We've added some more content to generalize this chapter. So we talk now about evidence, surveillance, and signals for updating. This is a more general discussion than is made in the more specific chapter in the online-only part of the handbook that's about updating Cochrane Reviews. We also say something about living systematic reviews and a little bit about the technology that we expect to increasingly allow us to keep on top of the evidence as it accumulates. We still have the content on prospectively planned meta-analyses, and we've added a reasonably lengthy exposition of sequential statistical approaches to meta-analysis. But after a lot of thinking and a recommendation from Cochrane's relatively newly set up scientific committee, it concludes with this, and I've pulled out the quote: formal sequential meta-analysis approaches are discouraged for updated meta-analyses in most circumstances within the Cochrane context. They should not be used for the main analyses or to draw main conclusions. And the rationale for that conclusion is provided in the handbook chapter. And then we have 3 chapters dedicated to studies other than simple parallel group randomized trials. We have one on including variants on randomized trials, where we talk, as James mentioned, about cluster randomized trials, crossover trials, and trials with more than 2 treatment groups, articulating some of the simpler approaches without having to move to a network meta-analysis, which is another way to deal with that issue. And then after the updated chapter on non-randomized studies, we have a chapter dedicated to assessing risk of bias in non-randomized studies, which is a summary of the Robbins I tool published just over 2 years ago, that has been quite enthusiastically received. And we articulate some of the core considerations for follow-up or cohort studies, for before-after studies, including interrupted time series, and for control before and after studies. I'll just say one thing about the risk of bias chapters generally. We have not included the full details of each tool in the chapters. We haven't, for example, presented all the signaling questions for ROB2 or Robbins I. That protects us from minor changes we make over time and allows an up-to-date version to be maintained outside of the handbook so that people don't get confused. It's also saving a lot of space in the handbook.